Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a world of flickering candlelight, horsehair wigs, and powdered sugar because we're going deep into one of the strangest fixations of America's most famously stoic founding father, George Washington's weird, almost fanatical obsession with ice cream. Picture it, Mount Vernon, summer heat, pressing in through open windows, fireflies blinking lazily across the lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a servant hauling a massive block of ice into a wooden tub so that the commander-in-chief can enjoy something cold and creamy. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the 18th century heat without AC, but Washington, he managed just fine with a spoon in his hand. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there, because this ice cream journey is better shared across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at Mount Vernon just as the sun dips below the Potomac River. The scent of damp earth tobacco and crushed summer grass fills the air. Inside the house hums with the low clink of dishes, the shuffle of polished shoes on floorboards, and if you lean close enough, the faint scrape of ice against pewter. It's not a dinner party. Not yet. It's just George, and he's preparing for his private indulgence. He doesn't speak about it much. He rarely speaks much at all, to be honest. But servants whisper about it the way he gets a certain gleam in his eye when dessert is mentioned, how he funded a special structure just to store ice year-round. It's 1797, and refrigeration is still 2 centuries away from becoming normal. But George is not about to eat his syllabub warm. Tonight he's not wearing his general's uniform or his presidential overcoat. He's in something loose or relaxed, maybe even linen. But he still moves with military precision as he walks down the garden path toward a discreet wooden door partially hidden beneath the orchard. You follow quietly the chirp of katydids loud in the stillness. He opens the door. The air that escapes is dense and cool. This is the ice house. It's not just a cellar. It's a 16-foot deep hand-dug marvel. Think of a giant underground snow cone cup packed with sawdust filled every winter with frozen blocks carved from the Potomac and insulated enough to last through the blistering Virginia summer. His workers would have hauled hundreds of pounds of ice, heaved them down with iron tongs, and stomped layers of straw or hay between each slab. No motors, no safety goggles, just back-breaking labor and a very determined founding father. It's easy to romanticize all this, but remember, if you're helping build this thing, you're probably an enslaved person. Cold comfort, literally. Historians still argue whether Washington viewed this system as an innovation or an indulgence. Was it practical food storage, or the vanity of a rich man wanting sherbet in July? Either way, you descend the narrow steps, ducking beneath the low beams. Your feet crunch on old gravel. The air is cold enough to make your arms prickle, and in the dimness you spot barrels, wooden tubs, and an old iron churn. It's a clunky machine part, science experiment part, torture device for dairy, but here's where it all begins. Washington didn't invent ice cream, of course. That honor goes further back, with roots in ancient China's milk ice concoctions and medieval Arab sherbets. But he helped popularize it in America, at least among the powdered wig elite. He ordered pewter ice cream pots from Europe, imported vanilla and sugar, and kept his own cows because only the best cream would do. No DoorDash, no 7-Eleven runs, just full agricultural commitment to dessert. And he wasn't subtle about it. According to surviving receipts, Washington once spent over $200 on ice cream during a single summer that's roughly $6,000 today. On what some say it was for diplomatic entertaining, others think it was just, well, George doing George. And if you're picturing neat scoops and waffle cones, pump the brakes. That comes later. Ice cream in Washington's day is more like semi-frozen custard in a ceramic cup, thick, messy, and eaten with flat silver spoons. No sprinkles, no cherry, just pure, heavy sweetness. You linger a bit in the cold. Maybe you imagine him here, back straight, even in leisure, holding a dish of pale yellow cream eyes flickering in candlelight. Maybe he's not smiling, but you like to think there's a glint of boyish delight hidden behind all that duty. Outside, the cicadas drone on, and somewhere upstairs, Martha's voice filters faintly through an open window. She's preparing tea, likely setting out lemon cakes or macaroons to go with the evening's finale. Dessert was always a production at Mount Vernon, and ice cream, it was the main event. And yet, as odd as it seems, this man of marble statues and dollar bills hoarding frozen dessert like it's classified intelligence, it also makes a kind of sense. He saw the future in systems and planning, in outlasting nature's limits. Ice, in a way, was rebellion. A cold, creamy I dare you to the sweltering world. You back out of the ice house, blinking as the warm night swallows you again. Fireflies dance near the hedges. Somewhere nearby, a copper pot is being scrubbed. And above, in the still dark, George Washington, father of a nation amateur, refrigeration tycoon, is probably licking the last drop from his spoon. You're still in the orchard, the crickets chirping like a sleepy lullaby in the distance, when your eyes fall once again on that curious door leading underground. The ice house. It's just a simple wooden structure nestled into a hillside, but what lies beneath is far more elaborate than it appears from above. As you retrace your steps toward it, you begin to picture what it must have taken to make this cold cavern functional. Washington didn't just dig a hole and toss in snow. No, this was a full-blown operation. You imagine enslaved laborers sweating through heavy coats in the bitter January wind, sawing blocks of ice from the frozen Potomac. The ice creaks and cracks under their tools, giant iron tongs, massive saws, and wooden sleds pulled by horses. Each block was heavy, slippery, dangerous. A single misstep, and you'd end up face down in the river, and not in the fun summer skinny dipping kind of way. They'd stack these cubes high on the sleds and haul them several miles back to Mount Vernon. But the real trick, storing them for months. Once home, they'd be lowered one by one into the deep cylindrical pit of the ice house, each block wrapped and padded with straw or sawdust, nature's sad attempt at insulation before modern plastics and foam coolers came along. And every winter, this back-breaking cycle would start again, all so the Washingtons could enjoy what was essentially a 1700s milkshake. Historians still argue whether the structure was modeled on European ice storage or whether Washington adapted it uniquely for Virginia's climate. What's certain is that he took this thing seriously. Ice was status. Ice was science. Ice was dessert. Inside it's cold, not freezing, but definitely enough to make your teeth chatter, and the smell earthy and faintly sweet like straw and milk had a baby and left it in a basement. You run your fingers across the curved brick walls, moist, slick with condensation. It's impressive, even a little eerie. This place is a refrigerator, a fortress of frost built decades before refrigeration was even a thing, and Washington, ever the planner, built it to last. Just imagine a 4th of July in the late 1790s. Picture guests arriving in carriages, stepping out in wool coats and crinoline skirts only to be handed a chilled bowl of ice cream under the blazing Virginia sun. It's a flex, a colonial mic drop, and you better believe it got attention. Now here's where things get oddly charming. Washington, for all his rigid posture and don't smile for portraits, energy wasn't just hoarding this cold luxury for himself. He often served it to guests, diplomats, cabinet members, even random socialites who happened to stop by for tea. And if that wasn't enough, he had multiple types of ice cream, prepared often flavored with imported ingredients like lemon zest, vanilla bean, or even orange flower water. Ice cream wasn't just dessert, it was foreign policy, baby. And the ice house, that was the linchpin. Without it, all this creamy ambition would melt into a puddle of disappointment. So each winter, he ensured it was replenished. Even into his later years, the general kept a close eye on the ice house, dispatching workers checking inventory, possibly micromanaging like a dad during a backyard barbecue. There's also something oddly human about all this. We're used to seeing Washington as the myth, the fearless general, the noble president, the moral compass of a fledgling country. But here he is investing time and money into what is essentially a glorified dairy closet. There's something endearing about that, something ordinary. You can almost imagine him, sleeves rolled up, peering down into the pit, muttering, could use more insulation this year. Now, to be fair, George wasn't alone in this icy obsession. Many wealthy colonists built their own versions of ice houses. Thomas Jefferson had one at Monticello. Even James Madison got in on the trend. But Washington's stood out not just because of its size, but because of how frequently it was used. While other estates may have kept ice strictly for medical needs or cooling wine, George, he made sure there was enough to chill his desserts through September. And let's talk about the danger of all this. Yes, danger. Those ice blocks didn't cut themselves. Workers, usually enslaved, risked frostbite injury and illness during harvest season. They'd slog through frigid waters, balance on slick riverbanks, and heave blocks that weighed over 100 pounds. Also, a powdered wig elite could eat something cold in July. It's the kind of historical detail that makes your pillow feel a little softer and your modern freezer, frankly, miraculous. You step away from the ice house, now climbing slowly back into the humid night. Your skin feels warm again, like you've been wrapped in a wool blanket. The orchard rustles faintly as a breeze passes through, shaking loose the scent of ripe peaches and damp leaves. Somewhere off to your right, a barn owl hoots once before going silent. Back at the mansion, dinner is ending. Silver clinks, glasses tinkle, and there's laughter now, polite restrained, the kind of social noise that comes just before something special is served. And in the kitchen, that's where it's happening. Churns turning, cream thickening, sugar dissolving. The whole plate is alive with the quiet choreography of dessert. And you know what's coming next. The kitchen is warm hot, actually, its hearths still glowing from dinner service. You step softly through the heavy scent of roasted meat and scorched bread, following the clatter of copper pans and muffled voices. Then just past the main prep table, you find the staging area. And there it is, the ice cream in progress. But this isn't your modern countertop appliance humming away like a gentle lullaby. This is churned by hand with a forceful, repetitive rhythm. You watch as a cook's sleeves rolled and brow glistening rotates a wooden handle attached to a tin cylinder submerged in ice. It creaks and groans with each pass, the churn rocking slightly as it thickens the cream inside. Tonight's flavor, vanilla. But not just any vanilla. This one started its journey halfway around the world. Vanilla in Washington's day is a luxury even more precious than it is now. Each pod has to be pollinated by hand, harvested with care, and cured over months in tropical humidity before it even thinks about releasing that heady aroma we associate with birthday cakes and cozy candles. Most of the vanilla in colonial kitchens traveled from the Caribbean or Madagascar, though sometimes through indirect sketchy channels involving Dutch traders, Spanish ports, and British blockades. Historians still argue whether Washington's vanilla was directly imported or acquired through third-party merchants. Some say he received it as a diplomatic gift. Others point to records showing large spice purchases via Philadelphia suppliers. Either way, it was rare, it was expensive, and Washington used it generously. The result? Something closer to a frozen custard than the icy scoops you're used to. Rich with egg yolks, thick cream, and heavy with real sugar, also imported, also problematic. But we'll get to that next. As you lean in, the cook lifts the lid with a grunt. A puff of cold mist escapes. He dips a flat silver spoon inside and pulls out a ribbon of pale gold cream, smooth and glistening. It's thick enough to coat the back of the spoon, but soft enough to melt on your tongue in seconds. One bite, and the vanilla hits warm and floral, almost intoxicating. There's no refrigeration here, no blast chillers, so timing is everything. The finished batch has to be served fast, rushed from kitchen to parlor before it begins to soften. And even then, it's a bit of a mess. The dishes are chilled in advance, placed in wooden tubs, surrounded by more ice, and carried carefully through the house like they're holding the crown jewels. And why all this effort? Because it's impressive. That's the whole point. Washington understood optics. He knew the power of spectacle, even in small, sweet moments. Serving frozen dessert in July wasn't just about pleasure, it was about sending a message. This is civilization. This is refinement. This is America now. But let's be honest, it was also about flexing. You don't build a 16-foot ice hole and import tropical orchid pods just because you're a humble man of the people. You do it because you want someone, maybe everyone, to be just a little impressed. And it worked. Visitors to Mount Vernon frequently noted the ice cream. Some wrote about it with surprise, others with thinly veiled jealousy. One guest described it as a delightful and perplexing cold cream flavored with the breath of flowers. Another claimed it glowed like morning light on the tongue. Okay, settle down, poetic 18th century guy. But still, people noticed. There's something else to love here too. You're beginning to realize that Washington, the mythic general, had a childlike streak. You see it in the care he gave to his garden, in the letters where he describes his dogs, and here in the intense attention paid to dessert. This wasn't some distant calculating figure. This was a man who could be moved by sweetness, by scent, by texture. And vanilla. That was his favorite. There's something soothing about that. The idea that the father of the nation, this famously stern, marble-faced monument of a man, had a thing for something so soft, so gentle. It makes you feel better about your own midnight cravings. And it makes the story feel warmer even in the chill of the ice house air. The cook wipes his hands on a cloth, signals another servant, and the dishes are off-balanced carefully on silver trays garnished with a twist of orange peel or a sprig of mint. You can almost hear the room hush as they're carried in. Conversations pause. Spoons clink against porcelain, and George, he takes his first bite, slowly, eyes flickering, with something you dare call joy. It's easy to forget how precious each spoonful is, how far the ingredients traveled, how many hands touched them, how much planning and sweat went into this brief moment of cold comfort. And yet, here it is. The ice cream melts fast. In the warmth of the parlor, the fire crackles. Someone laughs softly. Martha lifts her dish to her lips and sips the final melted spoonful like tea. The moment passes. But for George, he's already thinking about the next batch. You linger near the doorway to the parlor, watching the last spoons of ice cream disappear into soft candlelight. The room glows with contentment, polished surfaces catching the flicker of flames, and everyone's posture has softened a little, like their corsets and powdered wigs have loosened with dessert. But here's the truth. You can't unsee this whole creamy operation from the river ice to the fragrant vanilla rests on the shoulders of people who didn't choose to be here. Let's rewind for a moment. The sugar that makes George Washington's ice cream taste sweet. It comes mostly from the Caribbean, from brutal plantations in places like Barbados and Saint-Domingue. Sugarcane farming in the 18th century is notoriously violent. Workers, many enslaved, endure punishing heat-bladed stalks and long hours to keep that supply moving. It's blood sugar in the most literal way. And at Mount Vernon, the system runs on similar logic. Washington owned over 300 enslaved individuals throughout his life. They didn't just harvest crops and chop firewood. They maintained the ice house churned. The cream cleaned the churns, served the guests, and even cleaned the sticky bowls afterward. It's a harsh juxtaposition. Washington, with his noble image and carefully curated legacy, living in refinement thanks to a system of unfreedom. And ice cream so soft, so innocent, becomes a symbol of that contradiction. Historians still argue how aware Washington was of this dynamic. Some say he struggled with the moral weight of slavery, noting his eventual decision to free his enslaved people upon his death. Others believe that his actions, however progressive they may seem, for the time were too little too late, shaped more by legacy management than true reform. Either way, there's no ice cream at Mount Vernon without enslaved labor. And yet inside the house, the conversation floats on without a hiccup. Someone makes a joke about Jefferson's preference for Italian sorbet. Someone else chuckles into their empty dish. George excuses himself to the hallway, his expression unreadable. You follow. He pauses near a window. Outside, you can see the outline of the ice house across the orchard, lit faintly by moonlight. It looks peaceful, even beautiful, but you know now that it wasn't built by moonlight or magic. It was built by sweat and silence. There's a knock on the window frame behind you. A young servant, maybe 15 years old, clears the dishes. You recognize him from earlier, hauling ice down the stone steps like it weighed nothing. He doesn't speak as he works, doesn't break rhythm. His eyes are focused somewhere beyond the room, beyond the guests, beyond the sadness. And here's where it gets personal. Washington kept careful records, receipts, inventories, even names. He wrote about his favorite cows, his favorite breeds of wheat, and yes, his favorite ice cream recipes. But rarely, if ever, did he write about the people who made it happen. Their labor was invisible, folded neatly into the folds of colonial life. You wonder what they thought of this dessert. Did they ever get to taste it? Did they find joy in its texture? Or did the sound of the churn become just another drumbeat of servitude? And yet some of them were masterful cooks. Highly skilled, trusted in kitchens more than many free laborers. There's evidence that some enslaved chefs at Mount Vernon developed their own recipes, modified European techniques, and even invented flavor variations that became popular among the Virginia elite. One of those names you might have heard, Hercules. Though he worked for Jefferson, not Washington, his story paints a broader picture. A black man enslaved but respected for his culinary brilliance, praised by guests even as he lived in bondage. Stories like his remind us that history's footnotes are often its heartbeats. As the hallway cools and the guests begin to leave, you take one last glance around the house. It's beautiful, it's quiet, it's full of contradictions. A place where elegance was built on exhaustion, where dessert was made through discipline, and where the soft clink of spoons covered the echo of unpaid labor. Still, the ice cream mattered to everyone involved. To the guests, it was pleasure. To Washington, it was pride. To the workers, perhaps it was survival, or maybe even subtle resistance. The flavor was more than vanilla. It was complexity in a dish. You step back into the night. The cicadas are louder now. The orchard rustles gently. Somewhere deep in the woods, a fox yips once before disappearing into shadow, and beneath the earth, locked in that cold cavern, a few blocks of winter ice glisten quietly, waiting for the next party, the next scoop, the next silent revolution of the churn. The air is heavy now, warm and still, as you drift farther from the house and toward the far fields, toward memory, really. Because what's about to unfold isn't in the dining room or the kitchen, it's at Valley Forge. And yes, even in the middle of one of the most famously miserable winters in American history, George Washington was still thinking about ice cream. Well, not constantly. Probably. But the strange thing is, records from the Revolutionary War suggest that even as soldiers starved, froze and trudged, shoeless through the snow, General Washington maintained a curious commitment to creature comforts. And one of those was dessert. At Valley Forge in 1777, conditions were brutal. The army had little food, barely any clothing, and the snow fell like punishment. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Horses died in rows. The cold crept into bones and didn't leave. And yet somehow Washington's tent remained a strange bubble of structure. He kept a well-ordered kitchen. He maintained journals. And yes, he instructed his officers to source ingredients when they could, including sugar cream and even spice blends. Historians still argue whether ice cream was ever actually made at Valley Forge, or whether Washington just fantasized about it between letters and cannon reports. Some believe small batches might have been churned on warmer days when the supplies allowed. Others think it's more likely that he just kept recipes nearby, like an ancient Pinterest board full of wishful thinking. But one report buried in a soldier's journal hints at a rare luxury, a frozen cream served among the officers during a thaw. Was it ice cream? Maybe. Was it cold milk that had frozen by accident, and someone just made the best of it? Also maybe. You imagine it now. Snow packed into barrels, cream poured over sweet biscuits, the whole mess left outside overnight, and then chipped out the next morning like a forgotten experiment. The soldiers staring jaws slack, watching their general dip a spoon into something impossibly smooth. You probably wouldn't survive Valley Forge, but Washington, he might have survived with sprinkles. It's a jarring contrast. The suffering, the death, the amputations, and then dessert. It's not exactly fair, but maybe that's the point. You see, Washington's obsession with ice cream wasn't just about indulgence. It was about control. When the world was falling apart, when war gnawed at the edges of everything he could still choose, how dessert ended his day. Even a bowl of half-frozen cream, even a hint of vanilla, or the feel of cool metal on his tongue became a ritual, a reminder that not everything was chaos. And for the men under his command, maybe even just seeing him enjoy something normal gave them hope. Maybe it said we'll survive this. Maybe it said we're still civilized people, even out here in the mud. Or maybe it just said, don't talk to me until I've finished this spoonful. One of the lesser-known quirks of Washington's leadership was his insistence on dignity, especially when things got dire. He believed appearance mattered, that discipline, order, and small comforts like grooming and table manners could preserve morale better than any speech. So if ice cream was part of that image, we'll bring on the churn. You picture his aides now gathering snow in their sleeves, bartering with locals for a pint of milk, or coaxing a stubborn cow into producing just enough cream for one strange little dessert that by all rights shouldn't exist on a battlefield. Was it delicious? Probably not. Was it memorable? Definitely. And yet there's something oddly noble in the attempt. Like when someone lights a birthday candle in a blackout or plays piano during a storm. You're not ignoring the pain, you're pushing back against it. Washington's craving for cold dessert wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Of course, not everyone appreciated this. Some of his critics, both then and now, point to these moments as examples of privilege, or worse, detachment. Eating sweet cream while soldiers ate boiled shoe leather, really, George. But he didn't eat it alone. He shared. He understood the politics of taste, and if he could spare a few scoops for those who'd marched through frostbite and smoke well, maybe it was more than just dessert. Maybe it was diplomacy, or a thank you, or even in its own odd way, leadership. You settle near the imaginary fire now, where the logs crackle and the snow melts in soft puddles near your boots. In your hands, a crude wooden bowl. Inside, something pale melting. The taste is faint, barely sweet, but it's cold, and in that moment it feels like victory. As the wind howls across the Pennsylvania hills, you realize that sometimes the smallest luxuries matter most. A sip of broth, a clean shirt, a spoon of something frozen. And for Washington, ice cream might have been all three. You leave Valley Forge behind, the echo of snow-crushed boots fading as you drift back towards something quieter, more domestic. The battlefield ghosts dissolve into summer sun and chirping birds, and once again, you're walking along the gravel path at Mount Vernon. But this time, you're not heading toward the ice house or the kitchen. You're heading toward Martha. Martha Washington doesn't get enough credit in the dessert story. She wasn't just a smiling hostess in a lace cap. She was the silent architect behind many of the household's more elegant touches, and one of those A collection of recipes, her own handwritten receipt book full of pies, puddings, candied peels, and yes, frozen creams. Tonight, you're peeking into that book. Carefully, of course. The ink is fading, the pages crackling with age, but the handwriting is confident looping and occasionally smudged, like someone stirred with one hand while writing with the other. One entry catches your eye: ice cream, to be made with yolks and rich cream. Stir most constantly. You can practically hear her voice, low and practical, reminding her kitchen staff that if you stop stirring, it'll curdle, and you'll be left with something that tastes like regret and wet hay. The ingredients are simple by modern standards. Cream, sugar, egg yolks, a bit of vanilla if you're fancy. No preservatives, no corn syrup, just the basics, because back then food had no choice but to be real. But don't be fooled by the simplicity. Getting this recipe right was no small feat. You needed patience, strength, a steady churn, and timing, so much timing. If the ice melted too fast, you had a puddle. If it froze too quickly, you'd get crystals sharp enough to cut your dignity. Historians still debate whether Martha invented any of her recipes, or simply copied and adapted them from European cookbooks passed between elite households like gossip. Some believe she refined them over decades, adding local flair and seasonal touches. Others think her enslaved cooks did most of the improvisation using ingredients on hand and experience learned over years of labor in colonial kitchens. Either way, the recipe lives on. You can still make it today, but fair warning, it'll ruin grocery store pints for you forever. Back in the Washington kitchen, the staff likely used pewter molds shaped like fruits, flowers, or even miniature busts because, of course, Washington's ice cream had drama. And Martha, she knew how to plate it. The table would be dressed in crisp linens, garnished with sprigs of mint, fresh raspberries, if in season, maybe candied orange slices for flair. Guests didn't just eat, they marveled. And yet you get the sense that for Martha, there was joy in the process. Not just the applause at the table, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she could bring beauty out of ingredients most people took for granted. Cream, sugar, ice, turned into something worthy of celebration. There's an intimacy here that feels different from George's logistical obsession, where he was all systems and inventory and cold storage design. Martha was warmth, touch, and taste. She didn't need to calculate efficiency. She just needed to know when the custard was thick enough to coat the spoon. One story, possibly apocryphal, but charming, tells of Martha preparing a surprise batch of ice cream for George after a particularly long ride. She serves it to him in the garden under a shady tree as he unlatches his boots. He doesn't say much, he rarely does. But after a long pause, he looks up and says simply, "Perfect." That's it. Just that one word. But if you've ever served a loved one something handmade and received that look, the real one, you know what it meant. Back in the house, you find yourself near a window with a soft breeze curling in. The scent of lemon balm and warm cream still lingers in the air. Somewhere a spoon clinks gently against porcelain. You realize that this recipe, this soft, cold dish, wasn't just for dignitaries or diplomats. Sometimes it was just for them, just George and Martha, a rare moment of stillness between battles, ballots, and burdens. And for all her quiet dignity, Martha understood luxury. She wore imported silks, danced at balls, and maintained a household known for grace and sophistication. Ice cream in her hands wasn't just fashionable, it was feminine power, a form of domestic command. She ruled her kitchen the way George ruled his battlefield, with strategy and a little sugar. You step back from the receipt book, now the ink still vivid in your mind. You can almost smell the vanilla, feel the smooth chill of the dish. And though the handwriting has faded, the legacy hasn't. Because sometimes the softest voices write the sweetest chapters. You slip away from the scent of Martha's ink and spice cabinet and drift forward to a livelier room, a louder evening, because tonight the Washingtons are hosting guests. Important ones. Ambassadors state, dignitaries, merchants, cousins of generals. It's a presidential party, and yes, the ice cream is already in motion. The dining room sparkles with candlelight, reflected in polished silver and crystal. You scan the table goose on a silver platter, sweetmeats arranged like tiny sculptures, wine so old it might remember the French and Indian War. But the energy in the room is already shifting because dessert is coming. And among these powdered elites, nothing turns heads like something cold arriving on a hot colonial evening. Tonight's showstopper, ice cream, molded into shapes, flowers, pyramids, even a decorative urn that no one's brave enough to poke. You stifle a smile. Yes, they're eating frozen dairy, shaped like funerary pottery, colonial America, where nothing says party like a little death symbolism with your dessert. The servants glide in steady hands, holding pewter dishes balanced in beds of shaved ice. No one speaks at first, because rich people in the 18th century knew you don't talk during the reveal. You gasp, you nod, you raise your monocle. Only after that can you politely praise the remarkably elegant chill. You spot Washington at the head of the table, face composed, posture perfect, but his eyes flicker as he watches the reactions. He's waiting for the moment the first spoon touches a guest's lips. It's subtle, but there's pride in it. This, after all, is a victory that doesn't involve cannons. Historians still argue how many of these famous guests actually commented on Washington's ice cream. Some letters describe it in glowing terms, a most welcome curiosity one visitor from Prussia called it. Others barely mention it at all, leading some to believe that maybe it wasn't as revolutionary as we think. But in a world without refrigeration, even indifference required immense behind-the-scenes labor, and George made sure it happened often. During his presidency in New York and later Philadelphia, ice cream was served at multiple state dinners. According to diaries from staff and visiting diplomats, it became something of a Washington trademark, a reliable finisher, a scoop of national identity, if you will. Of course, there were problems. Ice melted, fast. Sometimes the churner broke. Sometimes the imported vanilla didn't arrive. Once a whole shipment of sugar spoiled in transit and ruined half the dessert table. There are rumors completely unverified, but too funny to ignore, that a young servant once slipped while carrying molded ice cream shaped like an eagle, sending the patriotic bird skidding across the floor in a cold, creamy death spiral. But when it worked, it really worked. You imagine it now, someone from overseas, tasting ice cream for the first time, the spoon pausing just before their lips, their eyebrows rising in surprise. Because yes, it's cold, but it's also smooth, luxurious, deeply flavored in a way that must have felt like sorcery. In that moment, America didn't just look civilized, it tasted it. Let's not pretend this was accidental. Washington understood optics. He knew foreign guests would write home about what they saw and tasted, and if they went back to Europe, saying that the colonies served dessert in frozen cups sculpted into cherubs, well, that was worth every drop of melted cream in his boots. And let's not forget Martha in this. She was the hostess supreme, orchestrating not just the food, but the pace, the lighting, the tone. She knew which guests needed attention, which ones craved flattery, and which ones, bless them, just wanted a second helping of dessert without anyone judging them. One particularly famous party, hosted in 1790 in Philadelphia, is said to have included multiple ice cream courses, one with citrus, one with vanilla, and one flavored with nutmeg and cinnamon. A triple threat dessert lineup. You picture the guests dabbing sweat from their foreheads while pretending not to notice how fast their pudding glaze was melting onto the lace tablecloth. There's something oddly charming about it all. These were powerful people, statesmen, diplomats, scholars, and yet here they were fussing over dessert, like school children, because sometimes ice cream just does that to people. And through it all, Washington stayed mostly silent, observant, controlled, but if you looked close enough just for a second, you might have caught the edge of a smile. You float away from the table now full of distant laughter and clinking glasses. The night is winding down. Dishes are being cleared, someone snoring softly in a chair, and in the kitchen, the ice cream molds are already being washed, their delicate shapes melted into memory. Back in his room, Washington stands by a small window, hands behind his back, watching the moon. The party is over, but the chill in the air still lingers. And downstairs in the ice house, enough winter remains to serve again. You wake to the soft scrape of metal on stone and the unmistakable smell of burnt sugar. It's early, well before sunrise, and yet the kitchen is already alive. Someone is fussing over copper pans. Someone else is muttering in French. And there in the center of it all, with his apron only half tied and his powdered wig askew, is Washington's moody French chef. His name was, depending on which account you trust, Hippolyte, or perhaps Louis. Maybe he used both depending on how dramatic he felt that morning. What we know for certain is that Washington hired several French cooks throughout his life, many of whom had just enough culinary genius to be both essential and entirely exhausting. This particular chef, the one currently arguing with a bowl of cream like it insulted his ancestors, he's got opinions about everything, and especially about pistachio. Pistachio, you see, is not yet a common flavor in colonial America. It's barely even known. The nuts are imported from the Mediterranean, expensive and oily, and at least to your French friend here, utterly divine. He's been pestering Washington for months to let him experiment. A green dessert, Monsieur President, something new, something thrilling. George is skeptical. He prefers vanilla. George always prefers vanilla. But this morning the chef is going rogue. He's soaking shelled pistachios in milk, grinding them to paste, folding them into custard, and churning with a speed that's almost furious. Every so often, he stops to scribble something in a stained notebook, muttering things like "La texture est trop brutale," or "Mon Dieu, les Américains ne comprennent rien." Historians still argue whether pistachio ice cream appeared on Washington's table during his lifetime or slightly later. Some accounts suggest early attempts were made in his household, perhaps as trials for more daring dinner parties. Others claim the French chef was fired before the final batch could be served. Not because of the pistachio, mind you. It might have been the creme brulee fire incident. Long story. But what's undeniable is that French culinary influence shaped early American dessert culture, especially among the elite. And Washington, with his cosmopolitan tastes and deep pockets, was an ideal testing ground. You lean against the warm stone wall, watching the chef argue with a young assistant. The boy flinches as a ladle is thrust in his direction. He sips. He pauses, then slowly nods. The chef grins triumphant. You've just witnessed pistachio's debut, whether George knows it or not. The truth is, French chefs were both a blessing and a curse in colonial households. They brought sophistication, technique, and flair, but they also brought attitudes, demands, and a complete disregard for the idea that perhaps not everything needs 7 kinds of garnish. This one at least seems to care deeply about the craft. He instructs the assistant on how to strain the custard through muslin, how to judge the moment, juiced when the cream is ready to chill. There's no thermometer, no timer, just instinct repetition and a little flair for drama. You take a peek at his notebook when he steps away. The pages are chaotic, half French, half English, smudged with cream and ink. There are recipes for citrus sorbet, almond milk ices, even a note about trying rose water next time. One page is simply titled, "For impressing the English guests, sweet, but not too sweet." He returns with a bowl, swats your hand away from his notes, and begins portioning the pistachio custard into pewter molds. He mutters a prayer, or maybe a curse, as he lowers them into a salt-packed wooden bucket. Then silence. The churn begins. It's a slow process, but a rhythmic one. Ice layered with salt. Tin spun by hand. A cold fog creeping upward with every rotation. The chef hums softly now, calmer, focused. For all his chaos, this is his sanctuary, and it makes you wonder how many quiet culinary rebellions happened in these early American kitchens. How many flavors were born not by presidential decree, but by stubborn chefs refusing to settle for plain. You imagine George walking in later, eyeing the pistachio, skeptically poking it with his spoon like it might try to escape. Martha leans in first. She always does. She tastes. She raises an eyebrow. "Interesting," she says. George follows. He chews slowly, then nods once, just once. The chef beams. Whether or not that moment ever happened, it feels true, because food isn't just about sustenance. It's about possibility, about convincing someone to try something they didn't ask for, and maybe love it. You leave the kitchen as the molds are tucked into ice for one final chill. The French chef wipes his brow, finally quiet. The boy scrubs the churn, and upstairs, the house begins to stir. No one knows it yet, but something new is coming to the table tonight. Something green, something bold, something that will centuries later be sold in neon-colored tubs next to the cookie dough and the rocky road. But here, in the quiet churn of a hot Virginia morning, it's just an idea, a flavor, a risk worth taking. It's evening again at Mount Vernon. The sun dips behind the trees, casting long amber streaks over the river, and a soft breeze rustles through the linen curtains. You move through the hallway, where conversation echoes like gentle music, soft voices clinking glasses, the occasional laugh stitched between sentences. But tonight you're not watching George Washington serve ice cream to impress foreign dignitaries or throw Martha a pistachio curveball. Tonight you're watching a different kind of scoop being served, one that carries something deeper than flavor. Because ice cream, strange as it sounds, was starting to mean something in America. See, you've reached the part of the story where dessert becomes more than dessert. It becomes identity, culture, a quiet expression of refinement that whispers we're not just rebels anymore. In a country trying to prove itself culturally, politically, morally, what you ate and how you served it mattered. And frozen dessert, that was status. Sophistication, a subtle nod to European elegance. With a colonial twist, George Washington didn't just love ice cream because it was cold and sweet. He loved what it represented: progress, luxury, power under control. A nation that could freeze milk in July was a nation with ingenuity, discipline, and perhaps most importantly, money. Historians still argue how conscious this symbolism was. Did early Americans truly view ice cream as a sign of national development, or was it simply a trend borrowed from Europe and turned into a backyard party trick? There's evidence to support both. Some letters refer to ice cream as a delicacy befitting a republic. Others treat it as a passing fashion, like powdered wigs or pineapple centerpieces. But one thing is certain: by the late 1700s, ice cream was becoming American. Not just an import, not just a novelty. It was being folded into the rhythm of domestic life, especially in wealthy homes like Washington's. And it wasn't only about what was served, it was how. You walk now into a smaller parlor used for more intimate gatherings. A game of chess is abandoned on the table. 2 glasses of sherry sit half-finished near the fireplace. And in the center, a chilled pewter bowl resting inside a cradle of shaved ice, with 2 ornate spoons resting on a folded napkin. No molds, no showmanship, just a moment between friends, or perhaps between husband and wife. This was the new version of elegance: controlled, quiet, thoughtful, a subtle expression of American dignity. It's easy to forget how much pressure early Americans felt to be taken seriously. Europe thought of them as bumpkins, wild-haired farmers with muskets and too many opinions. So yes, maybe there was some extra pride in showing that we too could host an elegant dinner complete with chilled dessert and refined manners. But let's not pretend this movement was inclusive. Ice cream was still reserved for the few, for those with access to ice houses, imported sugar, enslaved labor, and silver service. For most Americans, dessert was fruit, maybe pie, cold custard if you were lucky. Still, its cultural pull grew stronger. Cookbooks began to include ice cream recipes. American-made molds appeared in shops. Ladies' magazines described how to serve it modestly, but with taste. And slowly the frozen treat became a symbol not of rebellion, but of establishment. The revolutionaries were now socialites, the militias were now gentlemen, and dessert was the proof. There's a particular story, possibly apocryphal, but persistent, about a dinner in New York, attended by both George Washington and John Adams. They were served a vanilla cinnamon ice cream with crushed almonds on top, and the chef, eager to impress, declared it a dessert fit for a nation reborn. Adams reportedly rolled his eyes. Washington simply nodded. "That's our founding father for you, always a little bit dramatic, but with the quiet confidence to make it work." You linger in the parlor as the candles burn lower. The chilled bowl is half melted now, condensation pooling at its base. The spoons rest quietly. No one's bragging. No one's calling for music or applause. And yet in this simple moment, you feel it. America isn't just surviving anymore. It's learning to savor. Ice cream in George Washington's hands has become something symbolic, something beyond sugar and cream. It's diplomacy served on a cold spoon. It's a quiet boast that we can match the old world in elegance while still stirring it with a bit of American flavor. You glance again at the dish nearly empty now. It's not just dessert, it's identity melting slowly but unmistakably into history. You step softly into the pantry where shelves creak with the weight of ceramics, glass jars, and pewter bowls. It's dim here and cool, and a little dusty, just enough to remind you this isn't a display. It's a working kitchen. But tonight your attention isn't on the spice jars or Martha's lemon rinds. You're here for something very specific. Tubs. Because despite what your modern brain may be picturing, cones, scoops, little paper cups, ice cream in the 1700s was a totally different experience. No swirls, no plastic lids, and certainly no sprinkles. Colonial Americans didn't eat ice cream the way you do. They served it in shallow ceramic or pewter bowls often set inside larger wooden tubs packed with salt and ice. These tubs were not decorative. They were tools. Functional, sweaty, and usually leaking just enough to leave a mysterious puddle wherever they sat. And cones. Not even a dream yet. If you handed George Washington a waffle cone with a double scoop of cookie dough, he'd stare at it like you'd just invented fire, and maybe recoil a little, wondering why dessert now involved napkins stuck to your fingers and ice cream dripping down your wrist. Historians still argue when the cone truly emerged, some claim a version existed in Europe in the late 18th century, shaped from wafers and filled with custard. Others credit the 1904 World's Fair for popularizing it in America. But back in Washington's time, ice cream was strictly a spoon affair. Which leads us to the spoons themselves. Here's a fun bit of trivia. Colonial ice cream spoons weren't the rounded mouth-shaped tools you know today. Many of them were flat, like a tiny spatula. Imagine eating yogurt with a paint scraper, and you've got the basic idea. Some were even made of wood, rough-hewn, and clunky, the kind of utensil that made you think twice before asking for seconds. But in the Washington household, spoons were elevated. You pass your fingers over a small drawer of silver cutlery, elegantly engraved, cold to the touch. These spoons were smaller than usual, delicate, designed for precise dessert handling. No shoveling here. Each bite was measured, deliberate. It wasn't just eating, it was etiquette. Ice cream etiquette was a whole thing. You never licked your spoon, never scraped the bowl, never leaned over the table to get the last bit. That was vulgar. Instead, you were to take small bites, chew politely, yes, even though it was melting, and nod appreciatively after each taste like you were analyzing fine poetry. At formal dinners, servants would quietly switch out used spoons between courses. A fresh spoon for each flavor. Each course served in a new dish, wiped free of condensation, so no guest had to touch anything even slightly damp. That's how committed they were to the illusion of effortless grace. You chuckle quietly, imagining George frowning at a drip of melted cream on the table and Martha silently willing him not to mention it in front of the Prussian ambassador. But it wasn't all seriousness. There were moments of charm, too. Children, when allowed near the dessert table, were occasionally given their own smaller tubs, often decorated with painted fruit or birds. You picture a little girl in a ribboned bonnet carefully spooning melted vanilla from her painted bowl while her brother pretends not to want any. And you picture an older Washington watching them, maybe amused, maybe nostalgic, because ice cream had changed even within his lifetime. What began as a European rarity had slowly become something personal, something domestic. It was no longer just for kings and courts. It was for families, for front porches, for quiet nights with candlelight and simple bowls. That evolution mirrored the country itself. Less powdered pomp, more cozy permanence. You run your hand along the rim of a wooden tub and imagine the cold inside the tight-packed salt, the jagged ice. You picture a servant carrying it carefully up the stairs, trying not to tilt too far and lose the dish inside. And when it finally lands on the table, perfectly intact, someone breathes out a little, like a magic trick has just been performed, which honestly, it kind of has. It's easy to forget how hard it was to create cold in a warm world. No freezers, no backup plans, just nature and nerve. And when everything worked, the temperature, the churn, the serving, you didn't just get dessert. You got a small miracle. You glance around one more time at the tools of the trade, the heavy tubs, the flattened spoons, the cloths used to mop up leaks, the tiny porcelain dishes now cracked with age. And you realize even in its earliest form, ice cream was about more than taste. It was about ceremony, presentation, the quiet thrill of creating something cold in defiance of summer. No cones, no toppings, just cream and ambition frozen into elegance. It's a few years later now, and the parlor feels different. A little colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Something's shifted in the room, and you can feel it before you even step inside. The fire is still lit. The dessert tray is still circulating. But tonight, well, let's just say things are not as sweet as the ice cream. Alexander Hamilton is here, and so is Thomas Jefferson. You already know where this is going. They're seated at opposite ends of the table, each surrounded by their chosen orbit of admirers, one all razor-sharp wit and calculation, the other smooth, genteel defiance. Washington sits in the center, stoic as ever, trying not to roll his eyes, as dessert becomes collateral damage in a battle of ideals. The ice cream tonight is citrus-flavored, maybe lemon or orange flower. It's light, refreshing, safe. Or at least it was until Jefferson asked for his own. Not just his own dish, mind you, his own version. The man brought his own recipe, imported from France, infused with vanilla and egg yolks in a ratio so rich it practically required a spoon made of gold. He hands the instructions to the servant with the smug confidence of someone who already knows his dessert is superior. George watches silent. Hamilton stares incredulous. You're leaning in like it's reality TV. Historians still argue whether this moment or moments like it truly happened. But correspondence suggests that Jefferson did in fact supply his own ice cream recipes at several dinners, even insisting on a specific serving style he'd seen in Paris. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the pragmatist, found such indulgence ridiculous, calling it frivolity served on a spoon. So now dessert is political. Jefferson's ice cream arrives slightly creamier, sweeter, with the unmistakable scent of imported vanilla. A few guests whisper, one coughs to hide a laugh, and then Hamilton, not to be outdone, requests a second helping of Washington's original. I prefer simpler flavors, he says too loudly. Honest, American. Jefferson smiles tight-lipped. Oh, but refinement is hardly foreign, dear sir. Washington, chewing slowly, closes his eyes for a moment longer than usual, and you realize something critical. This isn't about dessert, not really. It's about image, legacy, philosophy. Hamilton's ice cream is efficiency, balance, structure. He wants the dessert to be firm, measured, predictable, like a well-funded national bank. Jefferson's version is flair, softness, nuance, a blend of styles, ideas, and imported elegance wrapped in candlelight and cultured almost. And George, he just wants everyone to eat and stop arguing. The tension simmers under the surface as spoons scrape the last of the chilled cream. Someone compliments the flavor, someone else says nothing at all, but everyone notices which bowl is emptier. By the end of the evening, you move toward the kitchen, away from the politics, and into the quiet aftermath of culinary combat. The staff are already cleaning up, washing spoons, repacking the churns, muttering in soft voices about that strange French-style batch. And tucked near the hearth, you find both recipe cards, Jefferson's in his looping, careful script, Washington's in plain inventory shorthand. 2 approaches, 2 identities, 2 spoons in the same dish. It's easy to forget that food carries ideology, but it always has. Who gets to eat? Who serves it? Who imports the ingredients and who grows them? Even a bowl of frozen cream becomes a battlefield if you're paying close enough attention. But here's the twist. Despite the bickering, despite the frosty tension, pun intended, both men helped shape America's relationship with dessert. Hamilton might have grumbled, but his economic models made imports more accessible. Jefferson may have been indulgent, but his culinary adventures pushed American cuisine forward. Like it or not, their flavors mixed then and now. You walk past the table one last time. The dishes are gone, the wine glasses drying, the fire dimming. And seated in the corner, scribbling something into a small notebook, is Washington. You sneak a look. It's not a letter to Congress. It's not a military order. It's a note. Ask cook next batch, less lemon, more nutmeg. Martha liked it, because even in the middle of a Cold War waged in custard, George Washington kept his eye on what mattered. You smile as you slip away. You're back in the dining room, but it's not a feast tonight. It's quieter, more private. The table is half set, only a few seats occupied. A chill sneaks in from the open window, and the candles flicker like they're not sure if they want to stay lit. Because tonight's about rivalry, and not just the subtle eyebrow-arched kind. This is about full-blown Cold Wars of the dessert table. See, you've reached the point in the story where ice cream becomes competitive. Not in the silly who can eat the most sundaes in 5 minutes kind of way, but in the refined, dramatic tension between political egos. Welcome to Founding Father flavor feuds. After all, once Washington made ice cream synonymous with sophistication everyone wanted in, but not just to enjoy it, oh no, to outdo each other with it. Jefferson, who you already know brought back recipes from France, took things further. He installed his own ice house at Monticello, imported special molds, hired skilled French-trained cooks. His version of ice cream was not just food, it was performance art. He served it at small gatherings and famously offered it at a White House dinner in 1802 during his presidency. Rumor has it that the ice cream was encased in warm pastry, cold inside, warm outside. And yes, if that sounds like the ancestor of the baked Alaska, you're not wrong. Historians still debate whether Jefferson's ice cream pie was actually the first documented American fusion dessert, or just a happy accident when the puff pastry didn't cool fast enough. Either way, guests were stunned. The French would have swooned. The Federalists slightly annoyed. Meanwhile, over at Hamilton's side of things, if he had a dessert preference, he never recorded it. But that didn't stop his allies from trying to one-up the Virginians. At one New York banquet in 1801, sponsored by pro-Federalist businessmen, a molded coffee ice cream was served alongside imported Madeira. A bold pairing and a bold message. You see, ice cream became a way to send signals: vanilla for elegance, fruit-based for refinement, spiced cream with imported nutmeg. That meant wealth and access, serving molded cream in the shape of the Liberty Bell. Now you're just peacocking, and it wasn't just Jefferson and Hamilton. John Adams, despite his frugality, was said to have enjoyed icy custards served during diplomatic meetings. James Madison's wife, Dolly, famously popularized fruit-flavored ices at her Washington parties, helping shape the social culture of the capital. Even Ben Franklin, decades earlier, had dabbled in European sorbets during his time in France. But Washington, he was the original trendsetter. Everyone else playing catch-up with spoons. What's funny is that while the men postured, served, and scooped with pride, the real artisans were often behind the scenes, the cooks both free and enslaved, who refined the textures, invented the flavors, and executed the vision with quiet mastery. In many cases, these chefs passed down techniques through word of mouth because, get this, most elite men didn't actually know how to make ice cream. They just knew how to eat it and write about it with flourish. You step into a shadowy corridor off the main dining room and find yourself in what was once the cold preparation space. Here you imagine two cooks from rival households whispering over borrowed ingredients. One smuggled a pinch of cinnamon, the other shares a better way to grind vanilla bean without turning it bitter. Because behind the frosty dessert wars was a secret web of shared knowledge. Techniques crossed estate lines. Recipes were adapted, sometimes stolen, sometimes improved, and every time someone took a bite and murmured, "What is this?" another name faded from the footnotes of history. Even George got caught in the crossfire. After Jefferson's famously lush ice cream event, guests at Mount Vernon began comparing. Some wrote in letters that Jefferson's was creamier, more daring. Washington, ever the tactician, responded not with words, but with upgrades. A new shipment of molds, a freshly tuned churn, a few new vanilla beans ordered through Philadelphia. Because yes, when the ice cream wars heated up, George Washington stayed cool. You stroll back into the parlor now, where the candles are low and the final dishes have been cleared. The air smells faintly of citrus and clove. Guests murmur their goodnights. Some leave with recipe notes tucked into their coat pockets. Others just dream about what they tasted cold, brief, and oddly powerful. Because that's what it was. Ice cream once, a colonial curiosity, had become the centerpiece of quiet political drama. It didn't shout, it didn't duel, but it said things about class, about taste, about who got to shape the narrative of the young republic. And as you lean back against the cool window frame, you smile, because you know that no matter how many flavors they invented or how many bowls were passed, only one thing truly mattered in those chilly contests: who got the last scoop. The sound hits you before anything else, metal on ice, a hollow rhythmic and relentless. You're not at Mount Vernon anymore. You're at the river's edge. It's midwinter. The Potomac is locked in a crust of white, and a crew of bundled frost-bitten laborers is carving it apart like a frozen loaf of bread. Welcome to the not-so-delicious part of ice cream the harvest. Before the dessert ever touched George Washington's silver spoon, someone had to pull the ice from the earth with numb fingers and dull blades. And make no mistake, this wasn't some gentle, snowflake-flavored wonderland. This was grueling cold and often dangerous work. You stand on the riverbank, boots crunching against the frozen mud. Ahead of you, a team of men, many of them enslaved, move with mechanical precision. Long saws slice into the thick crust of the river. One wrong step and you're in the water. If you're lucky, you get pulled out in time. If not, you're gone. Some wear gloves. Others have wrapped their hands in strips of burlap or coarse wool. The wind bites. The air smells like iron pine and desperation. Once the slabs are cut, huge jagged rectangles, they're lifted out with iron tongs, hauled by sled toward the ice house. Each block might weigh 100 pounds. Each trip is another mile, walked through slush and ice chips. The horses wheeze. The sled runners screech. And this happens all day, for weeks, just to keep the ice house stocked. Historians still debate how much of this process was overseen directly by Washington. Some claim he watched the harvest with a commander's eye inspecting every block. Others believe he delegated, fully trusting the system he'd built. Either way, he knew what it cost. Because this wasn't just ice, it was insurance. Each slab, a promise that come summer cold, would still be possible. And here's the maddening thing: most of the ice they gathered, it wasn't for drinking. It wasn't even for preserving meat. It was for dessert. For those creamy, melting, fancy plate finales that required salt-packed tubs and hours of hand cranking. You follow the sleds up the trail back toward the house. The workers groan under the weight. The blocks glisten in the low winter sun, their surfaces slowly weeping as they're stacked layer by layer into the deep cavity of the ice house. Hay and sawdust are wedged between each slab. It's dirty, scratchy, and absolutely essential. Without insulation, the whole stash would melt by spring. You step inside just for a moment and feel the cold creep into your bones. It's quiet down here, damp, timeless. The air smells faintly sweet, maybe from past spills of cream or fruit that drip down the tubs. Or maybe it's your imagination. And it hits you this is what chilled every dish of ice cream Washington ever served. Not some magic spell, not even some clever 18th century gadget. Just ice sawdust sweat and stubborn human will. There's something weirdly beautiful about it. This frozen vault sealed in earth and hay, holding on to winter like it's gold. You emerge again into the light, squinting. A servant slaps snow off his boots, carrying an empty sled back toward the river. The cold hasn't let up. The wind slices through every layer of clothing, but no one stops, not yet, because dessert depends on it. And this is what most people forget. For every moment of elegance at the dinner table, there was a moment like this, raw, uncomfortable, quietly heroic. You don't think about the men who bled from cracked knuckles while dragging ice. You don't think about the way they layered the blocks in silence, or how their backs ached long before the first guest arrived. But that's the real backbone of Washington's obsession. Not just the cool final product, but the brutally hot effort that protected the cold. You walk back toward the estate as the last sled disappears into the trees. The day's light is already fading, and the shadows stretch long across the fields. Tonight, somewhere inside, someone will serve something soft and sweet and cold. The guests will nod politely. One might even ask, how ever do you keep it frozen in June? And no one will say, by sawing a river into pieces. But now you know. You return to Mount Vernon as spring begins to flirt with the air, budding branches, wet soil, and that unmistakable scent of old ice starting to melt into the ground. The orchard hums with bees. Laundry flutters in the breeze. And somewhere beneath all this rebirth, tucked beneath the hillside, the ice house still breathes its slow, cold breath. George Washington is older now, slower. He moves through his garden with more pause than purpose, the stiffness of time folding into his posture. But his eyes still scan the estate, like a general every route, every gate, every churn. He's no longer president. The pressures of leading a young republic have fallen to others now. But Washington's routines haven't changed much. He still reads in the morning, still rides when he can, still eats with deliberate care. And yes, he still loves his ice cream. In fact, the obsession never really faded. Even after public life ended, even after the farewell addresses and national mourning, Washington returned to Mount Vernon with one goal to enjoy his home. And that meant, among other things, keeping the ice house stocked and the cream chilled. His correspondence from those final years is less about politics and more about farming, weather patterns, crop yields, livestock, and subtle notes about supplies. Sugar to be replenished, more pepper and nutmeg, and once casually buried in a list of tobacco orders, the note inquire re-proper molds. He never let it go. Historians still argue whether this was true obsession or simply habit. Was ice cream his indulgence, or just another detail in his military-style household management? Some believe it was symbolic, a way to stay connected to the civility and control he'd clung to for decades. Others think it was a comfort, a way to soothe the quieter hours. You drift through this dining room now mostly unused, but still meticulously arranged. On the sideboard rests an old pewter mold, tarnished with age, the shape unclear. a half moon, a sheaf of wheat. It's hard to tell, but you know it was once filled with something sweet and cold served to someone who probably didn't think twice about how it got there. And across the room, propped against the hearth, sits the wooden churn. You run your hand across the handle, worn smooth from years of use. You imagine the kitchen staff, older now too, still packing the tub with salt and ice, still turning the crank in slow, sleepy circles. Maybe the rhythm has become a kind of music, a meditation. One of the last entries in Washington's ledger mentions ice cream explicitly. The purchase of cream, the use of stored ice, the serving of lemon cream to afternoon guests. No big banquet, no foreign diplomats. Just a quiet Sunday in late summer. He was dead a year later. There's something deeply human about that image. America's most towering figure, sitting at a table, spoon in hand, enjoying the same frozen comfort he'd loved for decades. No spectacle, no presidency, just George, and a bowl, and the legacy didn't melt with him. Today, Mount Vernon still serves ice cream to visitors. There's a reconstructed ice house on the property, and on warm days you can walk the same garden paths he did then grab a cup of frozen vanilla cream from the museum cafe. You'd think that might cheapen the story somehow, turn it into a theme park. But strangely, it doesn't. Instead, it feels like the natural end of a very slow melt. Because George Washington didn't just help build a country, he helped shape the rituals of its everyday pleasures. He didn't invent ice cream, but he elevated it, made it part of America's identity, and for all his rigidity and reserve, he left behind something oddly tender, a nation where even the most powerful man could stop, sit, and savor something cold and fleeting. You sit now in his old chair. The fire is low, the orchard rustles beyond the window, and somewhere deep below your feet, the last blocks of ice are clinging to the earth, holding tight for just a few more days. Because the party's not quite over yet. It's dusk now. The shadows stretch long across the lawn, and the scent of honeysuckle rides the air like a slow lullaby. You take one last walk through the estate, your footsteps soft on the gravel path, passing the stables, the garden, and finally, the sloping earth above the ice house. The ground is warm, but below it still, the last remnants of winter remain, not just in ice, but in memory. And with every melting drop, the story of George Washington's obsession with ice cream drips into legend. You pause near the back kitchen door. Inside a bowl sits half-finished, the cream beginning to pool at the edges. There's a silver spoon resting on the rim. It catches a sliver of candlelight, almost like it's winking at you. No one's around, but you get the sense someone just stepped away, perhaps to refill a glass of Madeira, or maybe just to savor that last bite alone by the window. Because that's what ice cream became, didn't it? It began as spectacle, as strategy, a weapon in George's arsenal of controlled appearances. But slowly, quietly, it melted into something personal. At first, it was for guests, for diplomats, for the oh my how extraordinary kind of crowd. But in the later years, it was for Martha, for quiet mornings, for little moments by the orchard when everything outside stopped for just a spoonful. Historians still debate whether Washington ever fully understood what he helped start. Whether he knew that centuries later his odd little obsession would echo through diners and backyard birthday parties, through waffle cones and freezer aisles, through milkshake machines and 4th of July picnics. But maybe he didn't need to. Maybe it's better that way. Because when you think about it, the real miracle wasn't the dessert itself, it was what it represented. Discipline and indulgence, restraint and pleasure, war and peace. Ice cream in George Washington's hands wasn't a contradiction, it was a balance, the same balance he chased all his life. And now that life has softened into memory, you wander past the orchard fireflies, blinking gently in the deepening dark. The sounds of Mount Vernon fade to whispers. Somewhere far behind you, the last bowl is being washed. The churn is being wiped down. The ice house, nearly empty, exhales its final breath of cold. The scoop has passed hands, and hands again. Presidents and cooks, mothers and merchants, ice cream parlors and food trucks, all carrying the tradition forward, not out of duty, out of delight. And isn't that a sweet way to be remembered? So now you're lying still, the air calm around you, and maybe the hum of a fan is drifting across your pillow like a whisper from the past. The lights are low, and the story has settled into that soft, cozy space between waking and sleep. You've wandered through kitchens lit by firelight, watched ice pulled from rivers under frozen skies, seen the quiet glint of pride in George Washington's eye as a guest took that first spoonful of something impossibly cold. You felt the rhythm of the churn, the weight of wooden tubs, the hush of a room waiting for dessert. You've walked alongside the man, not the statue, not the general, but the person. The one who, despite the weight of a country on his shoulders, still saved space for something simple, something sweet. And now the world he built drifts into stillness. The trees rustle like lullabies. The last spoon rests in its dish, and the echoes of history fade gently like footprints, disappearing in the grass behind you. There's no more need to listen, no more need to remember every detail. You're safe now, wrapped in quiet, rocked by the soft pulse of story. So take a breath. Let your mind melt gently, like cream in a pewter bowl. Let the warmth of sleep wrap around you, and if a faint scent of vanilla drifts through your dreams, well, you'll know exactly where it came from. Good night, traveler, and sweet dreams.